You ever made a move believing you were helping yourself and your family, only to come realize that instead of helping yourself, you were hurting yourself? You bought a house and you bought at the top of the market some years ago, only to see house prices plunge, and then it left you upside down. Forecast for the economy was great, and you researched a particular industry and saw that it had a great upside, so you wanted to be an entrepreneur and you started a business. You left your job and you poured all of your savings into this venture, and then comes along COVID-19 and it shuts you down. A person follows God's call into ministry and into missions. They leave their career behind. And yet they struggle, and they struggle so much that it's almost impossible to support your family. And you're just like, life for you has become empty. And you're wondering, why has God allowed this to happen to me? So sometimes our journeys in life, they don't turn out as we would plan. But it's important for us not to lose sight of the presence of God. Today in our passage, we see a person who lost sight of God's presence through all the tragedy that they went through. Turn with me, please, to the book of Ruth, Ruth chapter 1. And we're looking at Ruth chapter 1 through verses 22. We're only going to read verses 1 through 5, but I will just say to this, in the movements in this passage, the first movement would be verses 1 through 5, the second movement will be verses 6 through 18, and the third movement is verses 19 through 22. But if you have your Bible, the book of Ruth, we're going to read the first 5 verses. Now it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took for themselves Moabite women as wives, and the name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they lived there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. You look at verse 1 there, we see where it says it came about in the days when the judges governed that there was a famine. Lets us know that this story took place in the period after the settlement of the land, after Joshua had taken Israel and they crossed into the promised land. But this was before the monarchy, before the first king was installed, before King Saul. But this was a period in the time of Judges when it says when everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And so this period is the nation Israel were basically following other gods. And so God was, in a sense, punishing them, allowing the famine in the land. And you know, if you studied the book of Judges, where this occurs during that time, it was a time when Israel would sin, they would go off into idolatry, and God would allow them to be punished, and then they would then beg and ask God to deliver them, and God would raise up a judge, bring them out, and then they'd go back and do the same thing over again. It was a cycle, it was cyclical. And so it was during that time that God allowed this famine. And it says a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and 2 sons. And so Bethlehem, everybody, is situated approximately 5 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And its most famous claim to fame is the birthplace of David, also the expected home of the coming Messianic king. The territory of Moab is mountainous, and it lies along the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. And so that ancient kingdom is known today. It's the modern state of Jordan. But we have Bethlehem and we have Moab. Bethlehem, Beth-lechem, Beth and Lechem. Beth means house, Lechem is bread, house of bread. Okay? Bethlehem, house of bread. There's a famine in the house of bread. Moab is the name of the son that Lot had with his oldest daughter. And then you remember Ammon also is the son that Lot had with his youngest daughter. But you remember they wanted their dad to have an heir, and they got him drunk and they laid with him. And so Moab was born, and his name means he is of my father. And what you got to understand is Moab is the enemy of Israel. You remember Moab, this nation was a forbidden place. No Moabite male or Ammonite male was to enter the assembly of the Lord to the 10th generation because they did not help Israel when they were coming out of Egypt. They failed to help them with food and water. Also, if you look in the book of Nehemiah, you'll see that. But also in the book of Numbers, you'll see where it was Moab that hired Balaam to curse Israel. And so we have a trip to Moab, okay? And what we have really is an abandonment of God's promised land to go to God's enemy. And so basically, everybody, what we have is a picture of Elimelech turning his back on God. Okay? And so it's in tough times that we should not turn our back on God. It's in tough times that we should turn to God. But anyway, when we come to verse 2, we're told the name of the man. Now, this is ironic. The name of the man, Elimelech, the patriarch, his name means, my God is king. But he's not demonstrating a life that shows that God is king. His wife's name is Naomi. Her name means pleasant and lovely. And then their son Mahlon means sickly, frail, invalid. And the son Chilion means weak, pining, wasting away. Again, they were Ephrathites. And that's an old name which indicates, in a sense, old residents, but they were sort of like an aristocracy or aristocrats there in their home. But we come to verse 3, and the text tells us that Elimelech dies. And the focus now goes on Naomi, who's a widow, and she's left with her 2 sons. And at this time, we don't believe the ages. We know the ages of her sons to know whether or not what her conditions are, but we assume that she has to be a single-parent mother to raise 2 sons in a patriarchal society. Or could it be that her sons are older, whereby they can provide for their mother? We don't know, but we do come to verse 4, and we see that it says, her sons take wives of the Moabite women. Not a violation per se. A Moabite woman could marry an Israeli man, but an Israeli woman could not marry a Moabite man. Sort of like, when God told them they could not marry Canaanites, but perhaps The sons getting married, this was a glimmer of hope to Naomi, to see her sons getting married and to see their family name being able to carry on. But Orpah name, the one who married Chilion, her name means firmness of neck. It was a possibly that was a reference to stately beauty and poise. And then Mahlon, who marries Ruth, Ruth means refreshment or friendship. But it says the marriage takes place within the 10 years that the family lived in Moab. And so we're not sure how long they were there, 10 years, but not sure when the marriage per se occurred. Could they have been married even while Elimelech was living? We don't know. But basically, Naomi had no control over her husband's actions to leave Bethlehem. But some would say that what they're going through with the death of Elimelech, in a sense, is God is orchestrating divine justice. And so if God is orchestrating divine justice, Naomi is not to blame. But then we come to verse 5 and we look up and we see Naomi also now has her 2 sons that died. And so the focus now hits Naomi again, but she's not just without a husband, she's also now without her 2 sons. All the males are gone, no providers, no protectors, no priests for the home. And so here Naomi's being hit by one tragedy after the other. And so if you can with me see the misery that is likely on her face, no children to provide for her in her old age, no grandchildren to help keep her happy and healthy as she grows older. She's a widow in a foreign land. She's cut off. She used to be full. She's going to express later how this grieving and all has made her empty. But here she is, a widow, and she's in a foreign land. At least if she was in her father's community, if she was back home, she had the possibility of returning to her father's house. But her parents are likely dead. But she could have returned as a young widow. Then if she was back home, she has the possibility of remarriage, the Levirate marriage in Deuteronomy 25, but she's likely past childbearing years. Then there's a possibility of her supporting herself through some kind of craft or trade, but that's unlikely. The majority of women in antiquity had no such options. But it's not just Naomi. We also now got to look at Ruth and Orpah. They have no husbands to provide. They also have no children who may grow up and be able to care for them. And so you remember the reason back in verse 1 that they left Bethlehem was basically there was a famine. They were going to escape death. But it seems like they ran directly into what it was that they were trying to escape. Please try to picture these 3 women, widows, sitting on a bench in the town square. Do you see them having a conversation in the local coffee shop? Can you imagine what their Facebook post might read like? Their Twitter handles. But can you see them in this story and watching this on your Lifetime or Hallmark channel, a movie or story of them? But tragedy strikes Christians at no fault to us. Maybe for you things have been bad. You've seen the death of a marriage, the death of a spouse, death of a child, the death of a career. You've suffered great loss, but being a Christian is not a prescription for us not to endure hard times. We experience storms We experience pain. It's just not a mountaintop experience. No, we have plenty of valleys. But we also need to realize that sometimes it's even the choices that others make that can have consequences for you. And so we are also the recipient of the choices of what others make. I remember when I first started on staff here at the church many years ago now. We were in the other office. When we had office, our offices were in the shopping center about 2 miles up the road. A lady from the community just came in and she wanted prayer. She came in and she sat down with me and she basically shared with me that her husband gives her his paycheck and he has her pay the bills. But she had and she was taking the paycheck and she was going and gambling at the horse race track in Charlestown, West Virginia. She didn't want any money from us. She just wanted prayer because she had to share this news with her husband. I never knew what became of it, how he took it, the news, and whether or not they lost the home that they were behind on. But her husband was the recipient of consequences of something that his wife was doing. And so we come now to verse 6 here, and we get a glimpse of some good news. We see that then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. And so the text says, Naomi rose with her daughters-in-law, for she had heard that in the land of Moab the Lord had visited his people in giving them, and it has the word food or lechem, again, bread, house of bread. And so we see here that the Lord, who is sovereign over feast and famine, had come to Israel to provide literally bread. And so again, we got to play on that name Bethlehem. And so here we have a distance of 50 miles that they are, in a sense, to travel. Okay? And again, this is the first insight that we have here of Yahweh, of God, but Yahweh has come to aid his people. And in a sense, instead of leaving for Moab, Elimelech should have stayed, whose name means, my God is king. He should have stayed in his land. But let's look at see something. We have land of Moab in verse 1 where they went to. Now we have verse 6, return from Moab. Back to verse 1, there was a famine in verse 1. Now in verse 6, the Lord has given people food or lechem, which directs Naomi back to Bethlehem. And so in verse 7, we see that Naomi departed with her daughters-in-law. Okay, and they're on their way to Judah. Let's go now to verses 8 and 9. It seems that somewhere in between, somewhere along the way, Naomi requests that her daughters-in-law return to their mother's house. All right? And so Naomi's possibly reflecting on, her journey from her homeland and how things were like for her going to Moab, but she's encouraging them to return to their homeland. So she pronounces this blessing, this prayer on them, verses 8 and 9, and she says, and Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go, return, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly, the word kesed in Hebrew, covenantal love. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Verse 9, may the Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband. And then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And so we see here, Naomi did acknowledge that Ruth and Orpah were good wives to her sons, and she thanked them, and she believed, though, that it was best to cut ties. Okay, and she basically acknowledged the kesed, the loyalty, the kindness, the goodness, the mercy, the love, and compassion, and extraordinary acts of kindness that they showed toward her sons, and she's asking God to now show that back. But she's basically telling them, you need to return to your mother's house and not be with your mother-in-law. And imagine, even with her stating this, if they were to return, she's now to travel alone. But amidst the crying and loud wailing that we see in verse 10, they both said to her, no, but we'll return with you to your people. We come to verses 11 and 13, and we have this myriad of reasons why they should go back. Not going to read it for time's sake, but basically, as she says, why go with me? I don't have sons in my womb that they may be your husbands. Return, my daughter, is what she's saying. She's saying, I don't have any more sons. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if, I wasn't too old to have a husband, I'm too old to bear sons. But even if I had sons, would you really wait until they grew up? Y'all would be too old. And so she says, it's more bitter for me than for you. And then she makes this statement here, the Lord's hand has gone forth against me. And she's basically saying that she's under a jinx. And she's saying, don't stick with me because the hand of the Lord is against me. And she's saying that hand of the Lord will be against you too. Naomi has built a strong case for them not to follow her, but she's barely speaking in their best interest. She's saying there's no future with you following me. Naomi said, I've been the target of God's wrath. She says, the death of my husband and my sons and your inability to get pregnant. She says, that's no isolated incident. The hand of God is against me. God has been out to get me. And she said, that same divine hand that struck Egypt with the plagues in Exodus 9, that destroyed a generation of Israelites in the desert in Deuteronomy 2:15, and also that punished the apostatizing nation of Israel in the land of Canaan in Judges, is stretched out against me. I believe Naomi's showing here that she's hit rock bottom, family. And if you go and you look again in 1:13 and continuing in chapter 1, verses 20 and 21, Naomi's voicing a cry in the form of a complaint. And here it is, she's charging God with unfaithfulness. Okay? It's a charge of unfaithfulness directed against God. This happens when people place their trust in God, and then when things don't turn out the way we thought they should have, we feel that God has abandoned us. But Naomi is basically making a complaint, and she's charging God with unfaithfulness. Have you ever felt like God's hand was against you? Your future hopes have become shattered and crushed. You've seen death, despair, divorce, destitution, alienation, disease. Naomi, she's wrong, family, in her assertion. But I guarantee you, Naomi is not alone. And we saw this in the life of Job. You remember when Job lost his family and his wealth and all that he had? And Job got the visit from his friends, and his friends were trying to tell him that, Job, you have some sin in your life, because if you didn't have sin in your life, these things wouldn't have happened to you. But God is punishing you because of some sin. So Job, confess what it is. Job's not alone. Remember Martha? Martha, they sent word for Jesus to come to their village because he whom you love is sick. And remember Jesus, he waited a couple days before he took off, and by the time Jesus got there, Lazarus had died. And as Jesus is coming to the house, Martha sees him and says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. We're short-sighted, family, to know what God does in our life. But we should never interpret God's love for us based on our circumstances. For in both situations, God was doing something for his greater glory. And so in verse 14, we come, and after Naomi speaks, she was able to convince Orpah to go. It says Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and was off back home. But it says Ruth clung to her. And so we have the contrast. One kisses and says, I'm heading back home. But Ruth clinging implies firm loyalty and deep affection. It implies leaving membership in one group to join another. And so when you see that in Genesis 2:24, the expression is used along with its opposite. What does it say? For this reason, man will leave Azab, his father and mother, and be united or cling to his wife, and they will become one flesh. And so Ruth's gesture illustrates her commitment to abandon her Moabite father and mother and permanently remain or cling with Ruth. We come to verse 15, and she said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Now look at verses 16 and 17. We see this magnificent commitment from Ruth, this statement. She says, but Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. And when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. What a devotion and pledge by a daughter-in-law. This is stronger than I might see some own, for a mother-in-law. This is stronger, regarding this relationship than I see with some true relatively mothers and daughters themselves. But she passes up her own mother, her own culture. And so everybody, this has to be something that's divine. But Ruth commits also to the God of Israel. Here is a Gentile demonstrating faith in God. And so we need to see the faith of Ruth to turn her back on her own country and family. Ruth's devotion to Naomi caused her to cast aside all concern for her own future and security. But here she's demonstrating a level of faith that some would say was just as strong as that of Abraham's in Genesis 12 when he had to leave his own country. And matter of fact, some would say it was even more because remember, God visited Abraham. Abraham had a visit, an encounter with the Holy One speaking to him. Ruth didn't have such. So hers is even stronger, but here, Ruth, if she should be unfaithful to her commitment to Naomi, basically she's saying, may God judge her. But everybody, this is tremendous faith. And I'm just wondering where this faith got passed on to Ruth, because I don't see that right now demonstrated in Naomi. And I'm trying to have grace for Naomi with all that she's going through, understanding all that she's been through. But it troubled me to see her tell her daughters-in-law to return to the country, but when she says, and to your gods. That doesn't really register with me for someone who's sane and who's committed to monotheism. But nevertheless, Naomi sees that Ruth isn't going to go anywhere. And so we come here, everybody, to the last section of 19 through 22, and they enter Bethlehem. They come home, Naomi arrives to a reception. She probably was hoping to come home unnoticed, but here, basically she's arriving to fanfare and the whole town sees her and they're asking, is this Naomi? They look at her and can see her fortunes had changed. She's impoverished, probably looking haggard and destitute. And Naomi says in verse 20, what? Don't call me Naomi, which is pleasant. She says, call me Mara, which means bitter. Naomi is saying, there's nothing sweet about my life. Because she says what? The Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I've lost my husband. I've lost my sons. She's broken. She's bitter. She's been through the storm. And then she says to them, I went out full, but came back empty. And so she says, why do you call me Naomi? Why do you call me pleasant? She says, since the Lord has witnessed against me and the Almighty has afflicted me. He witnessed against me or testified against me and he's afflicted me. And so the full, now empty, she left Moab for Moab, and she was full leaving Bethlehem. She loses her husband and her 2 kids. They were from Ephrathites, kind of suggested wealth. If you look at chapter 4, verse 3, you know when they came back that her husband did have some land, but she now turns to Bethlehem, but she's here. And her husband and sons are back in Moab, likely in some form of graves. And so she's basically saying, I'm not feeling blessed, I'm feeling cursed. And there are times where we may experience emptiness, and I can't imagine what it's like to lose a child. I have lost a nephew. I can't imagine what it's like to be with someone who has a terminal illness, but you lose your spouse. Guy in my neighborhood, his wife had just retired, putting in paperwork, they were having a house built in Texas. And he was wrapping things up and they were getting ready to move away. This was around Christmas. She had finished her job and they were planning. He goes to work, he comes home. He saw her watching TV, but when he come home, she's on the kitchen floor, deceased. Very devastating for him. He was full, he was ready to retire, but then life for him, it became empty. But she says, he has testified against me. She's using legal terminology like in a courtroom to say that she's being severely punished by Yahweh. The Almighty Shaddai has afflicted me. And so that word Shaddai there is not a name but a title for God, but El Shaddai, she says, has made her the target of his arrows and misfortune. And Naomi basically has a complaint. She says, the one who oversees cosmic justice has abused me unjustly. Job said the same thing regarding God. He was, as surely as God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty who has embittered my soul. Job 27:2. Job also says, the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks in their poison. God's terrors are marshaled against me. Job 6:4. Naomi was empty, but if only she knew God's plan, she could have saw in her life that it really was fruitful. I don't know who's here today, but you're ready to throw in the towel. Remember, God does not abandon us, even though it feels like it. God has us under his microscope. But imagine in our emptiness, we come to church and we just want to sit in the back and don't want nobody to bother us. It's praise and worship time, and really just want to sit with our heads in our hands. And we really hope that you don't come by to greet me. I just want to be alone. But we sit back. We don't want to praise. We don't want to read our Bibles. We don't want to pray. And then that's just the enemy having his way to further take you into isolation. And so here's Naomi. She thought she was empty. But look at verse 22 for me real quick. In verse 22, so Naomi returned, and with her the Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, who returned from the land of Moab. And what he sets us up going into chapter 2, he says what? And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Remember, there was a famine in verse 1. Now with verse 22, and what? There's a barley harvest. Naomi has returned home empty, unfulfilled and bitter. Her journey has been a journey into the depths, and she can see nothing else. But in her anguish, she cries, to the women of Bethlehem, spewing out her pain. But she fails to acknowledge Ruth's presence with her. She fails to acknowledge the commitment that Ruth has made to her. Yahweh has not indeed brought her back empty. And so remember the last sentence of verse 22 again. Anticipate what's ahead for the two widows. It's the beginning of wheat harvest. You may feel empty right now, but there's more in the tank, everybody. God will not fail you. He'll never leave or forsake you. When you pass through the waters, I'll be with you, and through the rivers, they will not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be scorched, nor will the flame burn you. We need to see that God is sovereign. Naomi didn't have an accurate portrayal of God. Her view was clouded by her circumstances. You never know what God is working through your situation. God's working behind the scene and in the shadows. But God is in the affairs and actions of the world, family. God wants his children to persist in belief. I know it feels like things are spinning out of control, but God is involved. Things are never out of control. I'm going to say this and I'm closing up. As we go into chapter 2, again, we're going to meet Boaz and see the generosity of Boaz toward Ruth. But then, remember, Naomi's life was more fruitful than she could ever know. Because you remember, we're going to come to chapter 2, and Boaz and Ruth are going to meet. And I'm not going to give it all away, but Ruth is going to be trained in a sense, but she's going to meet up with Boaz, and there's a threshing floor and all that. But we come to know that Boaz is going to exercise the right of redemption to redeem Ruth. And so she's going to be married. And not just married, she's going to give birth to a son. And the son that she's going to give birth to, his name is Obed. Obed then will have his family, and he's going to give birth to a son, and that son's name going to be Jesse. Jesse's then going to give birth to a son, and that son is going to be named David. Now, I don't understand how all this worked, but Ruth, or Naomi getting to Moab, bringing Ruth back, a Moabite, a place that they shouldn't have gone. God was writing a great story for Naomi. She couldn't write this story if she wanted to. Some of you trying to write your own stories. You got to realize God even works in evil. You need to make sure that you are just committed to what God is doing and saying. Because we, in our own humanness, will mess things up. And I'm just saying this to say, Boaz and Ruth give birth to Obed. Obed gives birth to Jesse. Jesse gives birth to David. And who's coming down the line? Jesus Christ. And if you go to chapter 4 and you look in the latter part of chapter 4, verses like 14 through 17, you'll see that basically this grandson restored life and sustained the life of Naomi. And she couldn't have written this story if she wanted to. And so all I'm saying to you, church family, is God is always up to more than you could know, ever know, or even understand. You know, let God write your story. You might feel like right now you are empty, but you don't know what God is doing. And perhaps you're fuller than you realize. Amen. God bless you.